Good to see you.
Good to see you, Lyle. We've seen each other frequently this past spring on the conference circuit, so to speak. The questions that I have for you today, or the conversation I'd like to have, is around support for your adjustments. There's been downward pressure from lenders and AMCs to appraisers to provide support. What does that look like? Where is it really coming from? And then maybe what we can expect in the future.
That is a great topic for discussion. I'd love to unpack this with you.
So let's start with unacceptable appraisal practices. And there are 3 bullet points centered on adjustments. I don't know if you want to cite those 3 bullet points or discuss why it's so important, but they're there.
I definitely want to tackle that question of importance. First of all, let's kind of level set why an appraisal, right? What is Fannie Mae's objective in requiring a current appraisal for a newly acquired loan? And the answer is we need to understand what the property securing the loan would actually sell for. What would it sell for right now, effective date of the appraisal? And of course, assuming that all the requirements of our definition of market value have been met. Why is this important to us? Well, this is how we price our risk. This is how we measure the risk of the loans that we acquire. And our pricing and our eligibility requirements are all framed around the loan to value ratio. So knowing the value is essential to getting that right. Failure to arrive at an accurate value estimate not only undermines the appraiser's professional reputation and the credibility of the appraisal, but it also damages Fannie Mae's ability to correctly price our risk and to operate in a safe and sound manner. So this is something that's really important to us to get right. Now, we've long recognized that the sales comparison approach is the most direct method to discovering market value, requires the fewest assumptions in most cases. But as you pointed out, since no 2 properties or transactions are exactly alike, this means appraisers need to first identify the differences between the subject and the comparables. And then second of all, they need to adjust for those differences. So the validity of the appraiser's adjustment rate is key to executing that, to arriving at an accurate value estimate. Now, some people take exception with us for talking about accurate value estimates, but that's not like a USPAP term. That's not what appraisers normally think of in terms of their professional obligation. But to us at Fannie Mae, that's what we need to drive our business. So you might think of it as we're requiring something more than what USPAP requires. Accurate value estimate is the goal. So the bottom line is we need the adjustment rates to accurately reflect the true market reaction to any differences between the subject and the comparables. Now, to your other question, our selling guide says it this way. Our unacceptable appraisal practices are listed on page 516 of the selling guide. And the 3 that are in relation to adjustments are use of adjustments to comparable sales that do not reflect market reaction to the differences between the subject and the comps, not supporting adjustments in the sales comparison approach, and failure to make adjustments when they're clearly indicated. Okay, so 3 facets of that. Wrong adjustments, failure to support adjustments, and failure to make adjustments when they're needed. We see all 3 of these issues in our quality control reviews of appraisals. In fact, these are some of the more common issues.
I would follow up with, I think it's important for folks to understand a $0 adjustment, by the way, is an adjustment. There's this misconception that somehow if we just ignore something or there's no adjustment that we're in a solid place. And that's just not true. I would also be remiss if I didn't remind appraisers and users of appraisal services that Fannie Mae removed the specific limitations or guidelines on adjustments, specifically net and gross adjustments, And I think for good reason. And I'm sure you'd like to share why.
You have to think about this in sort of a historical context. If you go back to, uh, let's say, 1989, the time of the savings and loan crisis, and in reaction to the savings and loan crisis, Congress passed legislation called FIREA, which hopefully all appraisers are familiar with it. And FIREA did a couple of things. One is it established USPAP as being the professional standard that we expect appraisers to meet. And number two is it established licensing, right? In that time frame, think about technology and data and how appraisals operated or how appraisers functioned, right? There was no internet really. I mean, internet was a very limited thing, not a general public tool, and it was used mainly in academic spaces. There was much less computational power in terms of the digital revolution that we've undergone, much less ability to aggregate data sources. And to a large degree, appraisers were we like to say, the eyes and ears of the lender, right? They're out there. They are the data gatherers, or they were the data gatherers at that point in time. Now, if you fast forward to today, uh, the world has really changed. And today, there's an enormous amount of data, an enormous amount of computational power. Uh, in the mortgage industry, the lender and the secondary market entities like Fannie Mae, we have a lot of information. So we're not necessarily looking to appraisers to be our data gatherers so much. In fact, the opposite. We now have so much data that what we really need appraisers to do is help us to sort out situations where the data may be conflicting, or in other words, analyze data and resolve uh, questions about what that data means. In terms of adjustment rates, like this is where appraisers can really shine, right? Is being able to look at a lot of market data and help us understand how the buyers and sellers, the typical buyer and seller, is reacting to various features of real property in that marketplace.
One of the concerns that Fannie shared, at least publicly at conferences, was appraisers were not making adjustments based on market reaction, but they were actually using these guidelines to limit their adjustments. In other words, I'm not going to exceed 25%. In fact, they would leverage the line item adjustment guideline, which was never a Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac thing. That was an FHA thing of 10%. And so they would literally stop their adjustment at a number as to not exceed that and not draw any attention to the report or criticism by an underwriter. So I was happy to see that go. I do think for some lenders, specifically Lyle, they have, let's call it, an allergic reaction to larger adjustments, where maybe I'm not, as long as the appraiser is providing support for that and is supported by the market itself. I think concessions, if you wouldn't mind touching on that, and specifically the first three line items, right? The concessions, the sale transaction type and date of sale, and how important those are into completing those first before we start making other adjustments.
Sure. Yes. So we did publish a little article about this in our quarterly newsletter, probably a couple quarters ago. And essentially, what we've found is that when the appraiser reports that the comparable had sales concessions, seller concessions, the appraiser adjusts for those seller concessions only about 40% of the time. So almost 60% of the time, the appraiser is not adjusting for concessions. We don't require that they adjust for concessions, but like all of the other adjustment policy, we require the adjustment reflect market reaction. So I like to do this thought exercise. Imagine you are taking a walk in the park, and somebody approaches you and they say, Lyle, Would you please give me $12,000? What's my reaction? Like, I don't know you. I don't know why you want the $12,000. What's in it for me? Why would I do this? Right. So a lot of questions, a lot of hesitation. I probably need that 12,000 for something else. My wife may have an opinion on what we want to use that 12,000 for, right? If I even have that. So the answer is probably going to be no, unless the person asking can persuade me somehow that there's a something in it for me. Now, if you think about seller concessions, what we see is the typical seller concession is about 3% of the transaction. And as you know, the median home price is roughly $400,000. So 3% of 400,000 is $12,000, right? When appraisers don't adjust for seller concessions, what they're saying is a seller who has previously no connection whatsoever with the buyer is giving that buyer $12,000 and expecting nothing in return. It's just not plausible. That's not how people think. That's not how people behave. So it really undermines the appraiser's credibility if they don't make an adjustment. Now, I think logically, most people would say there is probably some sort of tit for tat. And most likely that's going to be reflected in the contract price. So the contract price, if I'm a seller and I have a contract price that's cash, and I have another contract price that's financed and they need a seller concession, I'm going to expect that second contract price to be higher than the cash offer by at least as much as the seller concession, if not a little more. Otherwise, I'm just going to take the cash offer, right? So logically, that's how you have to think about it, is the seller must be getting something for the money. Now, if it turns out that that is not true, that the seller actually just out of the goodness of their heart is giving away $12,000, that's fine, but the burden is on the appraiser to prove that, because no one really believes that on the surface, right? So the appraiser has a higher obligation of demonstrating that that's the case when it defies what you might consider to be normal human behavior. On the other hand, if an appraiser adjusts dollar for dollar, logically that makes total sense to us. Like, no one's going to challenge that.
I know that you made some changes. There was conversation about mechanical dollar for dollar adjustments, and you've adjusted that. And I think that's a responsible thing to do, given the typical market participant, I think, reacts to a dollar for dollar adjustment. So, date of sale adjustments, I think you're still seeing challenges around date of sale. I'm focused on these three. I think they set the tone for the rest of your adjustments. In other words, I was communicating with an appraiser not that long ago. They didn't make any adjustment for concessions. They just said it was typical for the market, therefore no adjustments required. Their applied adjustments from a paired sales perspective or group paired actually made sense, except for the comp that had concessions. And I simply made the observation, if we do simple math and applied a dollar for dollar mechanical adjustment for the concessions, now the other adjustments made more sense. And the comp that had it fell in line with the rest of their comps. Again, tackling those first is, I think, paramount.
Yes. So if you mentioned market change or time adjustments, data sale adjustments, and that's another example of the kind of unintended consequence that you illustrated. If we go back to, let's say, 2022, nationally, the home price indices universally illustrated or agreed that markets were appreciating very rapidly. Not unusual. Of course, it varies from place to place. And I hear all the arguments about, hey, my local market segment defies the HPI. That's fine. But in general, we know that there was strong price appreciation almost everywhere. And in a lot of places, that was in double digits, like 10%, 15%, even 20% annually, right? What we found is that appraisers very often did not make any time adjustment. What that results in is you're comparable, even if it's just a few months old. Let's say it's 3 months old and your market is appreciating at 15% annually. You've just given up about 3 or 4% of the adjusted sale price by not making that time adjustment, which, if you're in let's say a purchase market, that could be the difference between your analysis supporting the contract price versus not supporting the contract price. So we see that appraisers commonly avoid making those time adjustments. And when they do make those time adjustments, they often adjust at a much lower rate than what the data, the analytics indicate. And this means that appraised values in such a market are coming in below reality. Like you could actually sell that property right now today for more than what the appraisal says. So we haven't complied with the definition of market value in that situation. Now, theoretically, the same could be true if we got into a down market, if prices were declining, right? And appraisers, have often a good intuitive understanding of their markets, and they do know what value that the property could probably sell for today, right? So what we see is that rather than just coming in 3 or 4 or 10% lower than they should, uh, they compensate or they overcompensate through other behaviors. And some typical behaviors that we see is the appraiser may choose a superior comparable and then may adjust that comparable down at rates that are less than the true market reaction. So let's say the subject has no swimming pool. Let's say you do all your work to figure out what the adjustment for a swimming pool should be, and maybe it's $30,000 or $40,000. I don't know, whatever your market analysis tells you. So you go find a comp that has a pool, and you adjust down 10,000, right? You just gained $20,000 in your analysis through bad mechanics, really bad mechanics. Now, you might land on the right value, but you've done it in a way where you've sort of contorted the analysis. That leads to all sorts of unintended consequences. Like people will read that and they can see through that and they can say, oh, this is not credible. And that undermines the appraiser's professionalism again. So the best behavior is make the time adjustment as warranted. Use the data available. We actually believe that an HPI is a great way to approach this in the absence of any other data. There are other techniques. There are more specific techniques. Paired sales is great. Regression is tricky, but if you can figure out how to do it right, that's good. Like there's a lot of different ways to derive market adjustments. Using an HPI is better than not doing anything at all. It's going to take out some of those distortions in your other choices around comp selection and adjustment rates. And then that's going to make you a more credible appraiser. It's going to make everyone who reads your appraisal more positively responsive to your arguments.
You touched on something twice now, once at the beginning and just there, and it has to do with the users of appraisal services, Lyle, or the reader. Not only are they more informed, they're more sophisticated today. The question right now from appraisers is they feel like this is a new ask from their AMC partners and or lenders who engage them directly or through underwriting. We've already established it's not that new, but why do you think appraisers think this is a new request?
Well, I think this gets back to what I was saying earlier about FIREA and sort of the changes in society. Over time, our society has become more data centric. Our businesses have learned to operate in a more data rich fashion, and we have greater transparency into markets and market function, market pricing than ever before in human history. The problem is, and the reason why appraisers are feeling more pushback on this is because the astute reader, the well-informed consumer of the appraisal report, is able to critique and challenge those adjustment rates with real market data, with real market analysis, with real statistics. And sometimes the appraiser's adjustment rates don't hold up under that scrutiny. And so then you're going to, potentially hear about that. I'm not going to say this is representative of very many appraisers, but I was shared a story about an appraiser who got a complaint about his appraisal because of his square footage adjustment rate. And the appraiser had adjusted something like $30 a square foot. The challenge had been that properties in that marketplace were selling for, I don't remember the exact number, $200 a square foot. And so the person who was reading that appraisal was saying, it doesn't make sense to me that you would adjust $30 a square foot when people are paying $200 a square foot. This kind of thing does happen, right? And there are reasons why that adjustment rate might be less than the price per square foot that you would calculate with a simple ratio, because there's a lot of other factors to value, right? So I'm not saying it should have been $200 a square foot. But all I'm saying is this was the challenge. And what the appraiser shared is that they didn't know how to respond to it. They were like, I've never had that challenge before. I don't know how to explain where that $30 a square foot came from. That's the problem. The appraiser needs to know where their adjustment rate came from. All the analysis that appraisers do should be captured in that work file. That should include the explanation of why they chose the comps that they chose. That should include the explanation of why they used the adjustment rates that they used. So it's all in the work file, right? Now, what I would say in this environment where appraisers are feeling more challenged, move that from the work file into the report. That's how you solve the problem, right? Explain, create transparency.
And I don't think appraisers need to be overly verbose. They don't need this long explanation. And they really don't need an explanation about every adjustment.
John, it's hardly about words at all. It's about math. It's about showing your work. You need to show the math. That's the best solution.
The forms that exist today will be on their way out, sunset sometime in the future, 25, 26. I don't know the exact date. And it'll become a reporting format going forward. Will the adjustment process look the same, or is it going to look different?
The dynamic report will allow the appraiser to embed charts, graphs, images, commentary directly into the portion of the report where it's relevant. So if you're trying to defend or establish an adjustment rate, you're going to be able to put that right in the same part of the report as as where you use the adjustment rate, as opposed to today where it might be buried in some sort of narrative comment addendum on page 32, and the reader has to go hunt and peck for it. So it'll be easier to connect the dots in terms of how the report flows.
I talked to Brian Reynolds, who's a mutual friend and acquaintance of both of ours. Brian shared in a YouTube video, and if you haven't seen it, check it out. The link will be in the description below. He goes through this exercise as an investigator of trying to assist an appraiser. The appraiser simply responds with, it's based on my years of experience. Brian was very clear that he's not suggesting that your years of experience don't mean anything. I know you're not looking for appraisers to say it's my years of experience or you just need to trust me. That's not what you're looking for. But what are you looking for?
First of all, we would love it for the appraisal to be transparent, so the reader understands where things came from. There's nothing hidden. We want it to be reproducible. So if we send another appraiser to do the same assignment, same effective date, same property, we would expect that the results would be very similar. Assuming the two appraisers are equally competent, they should get very similar results. And those results should be accurate, meaning this is hard to test, but I think you can do this as a thought exercise. If you actually turned around, put that property on the market, would it sell for that amount? Really, would it do that? Would you pay that much for it if it was your option? So those are the kinds of tests, common sense tests that every appraiser should apply to their results. And that's what we're looking for. Can the reader follow that logic? Transparent, accurate, reproducible. Now, what I would say is an even better is if those adjustment rates are quantitatively derived. Explain how the data at your disposal has been analyzed and how that analysis leads to an adjustment rate. Show the math. That's quantitative derivation. There's some great techniques for this. Techniques that we all know, right? Paired sales. Paired sales, my favorite technique, best technique of all, right? So direct. Sometimes it's complicated to do that. Sometimes you can't get a good clean pair on the feature that you're trying to derive, or you get multiple pairs and you're not getting consistent answers. But that's my starting point. I love using the paired sales approach. A second approach is depreciated cost. Okay, this can be a very effective approach. If a feature is typical in the market, abundant in the marketplace, then that means when people added that feature, they thought the cost was reasonable value. They're happy with the cost because they went ahead and got it, right? They went ahead and acquired it. So cost does say something about value when a feature is typical. There are some other techniques. Regression is a kind of a statistical technique. It's a little bit tricky, right? So if you're going to use regression, or if you aspire to use regression, you need to get some specialized training. There's more than one kind of regression. So there's what you might call single variable regression, which is kind of a one-to-one relationship. But there's also multivariable regression, which is much more complicated and requires a lot of data. However, it can produce powerful results as well. And there are some others out there, which I won't get into today. Use more than one technique, like try multiples and see if they get you to the same answer. Do you have to reproduce this on every single report? Well, maybe not exactly, right? So you can look at your kind of market segments and analyze adjustment rates for the typical features, and sort of have that in a file pre-prepared, and then you refresh it periodically, but you can reuse it on multiple assignments. I think that's a reasonable approach as well, to kind of save some labor by reusing your analysis. Bottom line is, quantitatively derived adjustments that are shared in a transparent way, that are accurate and reproducible, that leads to a much more defensible appraisal report that will protect you from accusations and concerns. So I think that's best practice.
We know the request for support for adjustments is not new. It also doesn't sound like it's going away. In fact, it might just look easier, and particularly for the reader in the new reporting format. But the expectation, and I do think you touched on this a little bit earlier. I like to use the term highest and best use. You said appraisers can shine. At the end of the day, if we recall why we're being engaged, why we're being hired by the user, it is to return an opinion of value on the real property. That is our highest and best use, and we do that effectively through the adjustment process, something that does require some skill and effort in analyzing the market. And so this is, again, our opportunity, and then to help mitigate that collateral risk on the lender's part, and of course the secondary market and investors. So with that, Lyle, I really appreciate your time today. I think it's important for appraisers to hear from a wide spectrum of appraisal users in understanding the genesis of the request, and again where it's going from here. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, John. I really appreciate the opportunity to share Fannie Mae's perspective on this.